John Sharp was a good old-fashioned Southern gentleman, one of the richest men in the state of Florida, and in the 1880s he made his way up from Jasper to Waycross, Georgia, and married the daughter of Dr. Daniel Lott, the man who founded the city. In that capacity, he began to sell the properties of the Lott family to new investors, people that were flooding into South Georgia, especially to take part in the turpentine camps, which were all over the Florida-Georgia state line. Then, on March 12, 1906, he was assassinated with 2 loads of buckshot fired into his chest from an unknown assassin hiding under his porch. The murder has never been solved, and it was only mentioned a few times in the papers, but the story seems so fantastic that it leads me to a lot of conclusions I won't even say in the video, but hopefully, through a little bit of context clues and some old newspaper clippings, you'll be able to put some of the pieces together today. And this is the grave of Dan Lott, and his daughter, Fanny, is buried right over here. And in the shadow of the grave of the man who founded this city, Dr. Daniel Lott, is his daughter, Fanny Lott Sharp. And all of these families were rich and aristocratic from the Deep South. She married into the Sharp family, while John Sharp began selling properties that her father had owned and beautified. But what was a little bit unusual is that those two were married in 1887, while several years earlier, her previous husband, Josiah Sermons, had likewise died a little bit young. He was born in 1849, and papers at the time mentioned that they had 4 children. Well, only 2 children are buried right here. One was age 5, and the other was 24 when they died, and they died several years apart. Obviously, one of them died a couple years before she married John Sharp. The other one died several years later at age 24. No, I'm not suggesting any foul play at all. After all, there is no evidence for any of these claims, but there are some old newspaper clippings that I find interesting. Apparently, when Josiah Sermons died, his parents, both in their 60s, submitted paperwork to the Lott family, many of whom were lawyers, relinquishing all control over Sermons' properties, both in Georgia and in Florida. And it's a little unusual considering that Sermons was one of the wealthiest men in the area at the time. John Sharp married into the Lott family in 1887 and immediately began palling around with some of Fanny's brothers. Again, the doctors and lawyers who had helped settle the affairs of her previous husband, who's buried right next to her, Josiah Sermons. So consider this. I'm not making any statements here, but it is a little unusual that John Sharp, one of the richest men in Florida, married Fanny Lott, whose previous husband, another one of the richest men in South Georgia and North Florida, had passed away prematurely only a few years before they got married. And then over the subsequent years, she would lose her children to that previous marriage. That previous husband, Josiah Sermons, had his elderly parents turn over all of his property to the Lott family through the brother Warren Lott. And again, when John Sharp left for Louisiana, supposedly, and wasn't seen for several years, he likewise turned over all of his property to the Lott family through his wife's, or his ex-wife's now, brother, Warren. And to witness to this was another brother, John Lott, both sons of the founder of the city of Waycross, Dr. Daniel Lott, an officer in the 4th Georgia Cavalry of the Confederate States of America. No, I'm not sure what to make of the following information, but it seems like John Sharp was out west, probably in Texas or Louisiana, when in 1902 it was published in the papers that Dr. Daniel Lott, the city's founder, found oil in his wells. Well, pretty much immediately, John Sharp returns, makes amends with his ex-wife Fanny, and starts to spread information through the local papers that they found oil in many wells around town, and all the papers in South Georgia start reporting on the possibility of a new oil boom town right here in Waycross. Now, this would make both the Lott family and the Sharp family incredibly influential and wealthy on a national level. To have oil booming in a town where basically it's already in the middle of the turpentine fields, you would be the hub of industry in all of the Southeast. Well, it seems like this dried up. There was no oil discovered in Waycross, but by 1906, John Sharp was again influential. He'd made amends with his wife Fanny, and he was sort of living with them. But in 1906, he was assassinated, and the details of that are a bit unusual. On March 12, 1906, John Sharp and his wife Fanny were out with their children at church, and later in the night at around 8:15 p.m., for some reason, John Sharp left church early, not with his wife and kids, and walked back to his house, which was coincidentally, I believe, right next to Dan Lott's house. And as he's opening his door, someone springs forth from underneath the porch and fires 2 blasts of buckshot right into his chest, running off into the night. This was hardly reported in local papers, but it was said to be an assassination. It was never solved, but the story kind of continues. I really don't know what to make of this, but if I'm going to speculate, I would say that around 1902, the Lott brothers, the lawyers and doctors of the family, decided to write John Sharp, who was hiding out west, probably for fear of his life, because he had meddled in a family that was a little bit too rich for his tastes. They said, if you come back, you were a good property salesman. So we could cook up this whole fantastic lie about the discovery of oil, and then while the boom is just at its height, you can sell all of our family's properties. And from 1902 to 1906, he's a fantastically wealthy man, but for some reason, on March 12, 1906, he's shot in the chest. And I do think it's a little unusual, perhaps not related, that he is buried over here, even though he's her second husband, while she's buried next to her first husband in the family plot, a couple dozen yards away, next to her father. When talking about family feuding in the Deep South, oftentimes people only want to talk about Appalachia because you've got the Hatfields and McCoys, but in reality there's a similar type of feuding down in the far, far south, around the swamps, around the Great Okefenokee in the Everglades, and right here we have the grave of Warren Lott, who was killed in 1915. Now, this was one of the most sensational murders in the state of Georgia at the time, because right after he killed his own son, his father, George Washington Lott, was overcome with grief, and he turned himself into the police. And you might be wondering, why would a man kill his own son? Well, I think it relates a little bit to the death of John Sharp in 1906. By this point in the video, you can probably tell that the Lott clan cared deeply about the power and influence they held over the deep southeast part of the state, and when George Washington Lott learned that his son Warren had married Marjorie O'Quinn, he arrived at the house with a shotgun, he was drunk at the time, and said he was going to kill the man's wife and kids. Now the reason for this is because Marjorie O'Quinn was the daughter of Isom O'Quinn, who had 18 children. A man who had only ever lived in the same cabin his entire life. And he said, Warren, you're a Freemason, you're a businessman, you've bested me in several business deals, you can't have this riffraff just tying you down. And naturally, when his son Warren grabbed the shotgun, it went off. And distraught, his father immediately turned himself into the police. Only a few years later, he was given a full pardon by the governor, who understood that he was just an old man trying to preserve his family name. And I think from this we can learn that the Lott family was not above murder, or at least members of the Lott clan were not above murder, to preserve their lineage, their legacy.